Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk about a book called How Do You Live by Genzaburo Yoshino. So, this book was written by a author who was born in 1899 in Tokyo, Japan, and he wrote this book in the 1930s. So, what was going on in the 1930s in Japan? Since 1925, according to the book's documentation and just other historical research, there was a lot of oppression in Japan due to different factors, such as the rise of fascism in Japan, what we would consider, and its context within the Axis alliance in World War II. So Japan was allied with the Germans, who increasingly had fascist beliefs starting in the late 1920s with the fall of the Weimar Republic to the rise of Adolf Hitler with the National Socialist Party, and Hitler, of course, becoming chancellor in 1933. And so Japan kind of followed the same path. There was essentially a major dispute between officials in the army, and where there were two major factions, and basically one of them was very extreme, and the other one wanted to give the emperor more authority, essentially. And eventually the authority group won, because the more extreme group tried to do a coup and it failed. And so individuals like Hideki Tojo had the ability to rise in the ranks due to this. They were able to get more authority and become prime minister in government. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's a bit out of the scope for this video. I just wanted to give some context for people who may not be aware of how 1930s Japan was. So anyways, so this book was developed by the author. Again, his name was Genzaburo Yoshino, and he essentially was what we would now consider a leftist. He believed in more socialistic policies in comparison to the Japanese government at the time. And so in this book, there are definitely motifs and ideas in which would be now, I suppose, labeled socialism. However, what I find about this book very impressive is that it provides a narrative with multiple characters, but it doesn't really, it's not really propaganda. It's more of like, it's a good story that has, it has like ideas from that way of thinking, essentially. So keep in mind, there is definitely a bias in this book, but it's very good, and especially if you plan on watching the Studio Ghibli movie that I believe will come out in 2023, this is definitely worthwhile. So let me get into it. I'm going to talk in chronologically about the book and the major themes of the book. I'll try not to talk about too much specifics, although that cannot be avoided. So if you don't want any sort of spoilers, you probably should click away. Okay, now that we got past that, so I have some sticky notes with me to help me keep on track of certain themes of the book. And so that's what I will be looking at here. And so, the main character, his name is, I guess you could say Copper, or Cooper, depending on how you want to look at it, how you pronounce name. His real name is Honda Junichi, and he is what I guess you would say a middle school / young high schooler in somewhere like the United States. And he basically is a very curious young man. He isn't very talented in sports. He kind of just is very bookish, I guess you could say. He's very short. Unfortunately for him, his character had a father who was quite prominent in a bank, and unfortunately he passed away. So he lives with his mother, and he has a uncle who is her younger brother involved in his life. And he kind of acts as sort of a father figure without being the father, and provides some very good advice in the book. And he does this not only by talking to Cooper, or Copper, I guess we'll say Cooper. He does this not only by talking to him, but he leaves these notebooks in which it talks about the different themes of which they discuss for the day. So they move on. So let's talk about, let's see. Okay, so he's in the Ginza district of Tokyo, which is a very busy area, especially back in that time. Tokyo was very rural in comparison to today. I mean, it was almost 100 years ago now. And he has an epiphany, excuse me, where he's like, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of people here. And he's seeing them from an aerial view, and he's like, wow, gosh, these people are kind of like raindrops. And so he's like, whoa, what if we're all raindrops in a scheme of things? What if we're not like that important as individuals in ourselves, but rather we're important as a collective? And so his uncle, seeing this 14-year-old, 15-year-old kid say these things, he's like, wow, that's quite a realization. And this is how Mr. Honda gets his nickname. And his nickname is actually based off of the famous Copernicus. And so Copernicus, of course, was the individual who essentially came up with the idea in which the Earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa. And of course, for those of you aware of European history, he was persecuted, and in the same vein as someone like Galileo Galilei by the church, because they did not accept that, because they felt like the most important factor was God, and science cannot overstate that. That's a very simplified version, but that's essentially what happened. So they felt it was a threat to the dogma, and they persecuted Copernicus. So basically, the idea here is that the main character, Copper, is he is a sort of independent thinker among a lot of people who do not think like him. He's coming up with the new ideas that a lot of people would not realize or don't care, basically. So that's where the nickname comes from. So he says that humans are like molecules. So the uncle tells him about this, and so he goes on his way with this nickname that he has. So Cooper also has these individuals that he's friends with, and one of them is named Kitani, who is basically very outspoken individual. He's type he can be antagonistic sometimes. Like if he doesn't understand it, he will stick to his guns, and he's like, yeah, so what? I believe this, and I'm gonna fight you for it, because teenagers do that kind of thing. And so he also has friends with a upper class individual named Mizutani, who lives in a very nice house, has I guess you could say very upper class parents, and he has a sister and brother, but we'll get back to that later. And they're all friends, and so with Cooper, and he's not the most sociable guy, but he does have some friends. There's also one other character named Umagawa, who we'll talk about in a little bit, and he basically he has a lot of struggles in his life based on his circumstances, and so a lot of people make fun of him because of that. He doesn't really have a lot of friends except for maybe Copper later on. Anyways, so they talk about they're in a school setting, and they're just going on their days. It's like traditional school. So they go to classes, but then there's like monologues from the characters discussing, what's happening in their lives, essentially. And so people, comment on Uragawa, and they kind of make fun of him because he always eats tofu. And so he's not very good at things. And back then, sports were very important, like they are today in some parts of the world. So, I mean, he doesn't have a lot going for him, essentially. And so, it's not easy to be his friend, basically. But yet, they still end up trying to be, despite fun. Well, eventually, Uragawa one day he gets picked on hard enough by this kid Yamaguchi and his friends, and they basically gang up on him. Well, Kizutani doesn't like how he's being ganged up on all the time, and so he basically fights the kid over argument. They argued because they wanted Uragawa to do something humiliating, and so they put him in a bad position, and Kizutani defends him, essentially. So they end up having to apologize to one another after their professor, their teacher, steps in. And he's like, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you fighting each other? Stop it!" Basically. And so, this is the first indication where Cooper tells his uncle, he tells his uncle about what happened, and he said, it was good that they stood up for him, Uragawa. However, Uragawa also at the same time, needs to develop a backbone. He needs to stand up for himself. And people who don't stand up for themselves, they tend to be manipulated, taken advantage of. That's what his uncle says. So he says, yes, he does pity him, but at the same time, though, he needs to also develop himself. Otherwise, he'll be abused. And so it continues on. Let's see. So Cooper's sympathetic to him, and he doesn't want that to happen, and he hopes that things can change. Okay. And so he keeps thinking about different ideas. Well, his original idea, Cooper's original idea, was about the molecules. Well, he started to think, hey, wait a minute, what about these big ideas like gravity and stuff like that? How is it that these molecules are all related to each other? Because all humanity is necessary for different things. How is it that that we all have the things we have when we're just humans after all? So it's amazing how we all interact with each other. And basically his uncle's like, wow, that's an interesting idea, how things are connected. Now, there's economic ideas for what you're saying, but it's really good that you're thinking out of the box, and you should keep with it. And that's a very important theme of the story, is to keep with it. That the uncle tells Cooper, to keep thinking and go on. Okay, so let's see. And yeah, so they talk about the logistics. Specifically, it was talking about milk and how the cows have to be in Australia, and then they move through ports and so on and so forth. So the molecules in other countries are involving themselves with molecules of different places and so on, and then they keep interacting to eventually products come into Japan. And it's amazing for Cooper and other people how they're able to enjoy this, basically, and how it's important to value individuals at every level due to this connected chain. And I think that's a very important thing in our modern world. It's very easy for some people to look down on other people because they're in a lower position. However, in order to keep the system going, we kind of need this. So he was talking about, the following day, I think it was the following day or the next couple of days, there was Uragawa, the kid who was bullied and the kids fought over. He disappeared, and so he's gone for a couple of days, and they're wondering, okay, where did he go? What happened to him? And so eventually Cooper decides to check in on him. Well, he discovers Uragawa lives in a district which is very working class, very borderline poor, but not the poorest, but they run a shop, but they don't have a lot of extra money, and they can't really hire people. So basically, one of their workers got sick, and so the student Uragawa has to he has to fill in essentially. And so Cooper kind of just watches him work, and he's like, wow, Uragawa, who's not known for having a lot of skills, is doing these amazing things with cooking and preparing tofu, and it explains the process behind that. And it shows hey, he may not be good at math or different subjects, but he definitely has some skills and some strength that his other classmates don't have. And so it shows that he's a very humble individual, but yet he's still trying the best he can, even though he's not good at things. And I think that's a very important message for a lot of people, because some people are born with natural talent, but the vast majority of people have to earn where they are in the world. It's just the way it is. And I think that's really good. So for a young reader, for reading a book like this would be I think it'd be motivational if you have the right mindset, or in a close proximity of that mindset, because it's the hustle, it's the goal setting that's really going to get you anywhere in this world. And I think we could all see that. Okay, so he finds out, he gets an appreciation, and so let's see. He goes to his after that. So Cooper helps him out for a little bit to catch up on his studies, and then eventually he returns to school and just keeps helping him. Eventually they go to Mizutani, the wealthier individual's house, and he has a sister, Katsuko, and she's like an athletic type who's like, but she's really open minded, and she's very romantic in the way as she thinks about like these great figures of history, and like seeking out greater goals than one has right now. Because it would mention that she was trying for the Olympics, for example, which is a great goal, of course, for an athlete. And so she talks about, they hang out, and the group, there's Mizutani, Uragawa, talk about things, and they discuss about figures in history, like, let's see, they talk about Napoleon Bonaparte, and his, Katsuko talks about how, like, extraordinary he was, and how great he was, because they have paintings on the wall, so they talk about that. And, important, like, people like Oda Nobunaga, or Toyotomi Hideyoshi, people like that. And so, like, these great figures in history and how they move with time and so on. And the uncle, after he hears from Cooper talking about, the talk about these great people, talks about, yes, Napoleon's a very interesting history person. However, he's more of flowing with the time rather than he being a long-lasting individual, and how moving with the time is much more important, because Napoleon's career lasted only a certain amount of time. He, just like Alexander the Great. And so, like, it's more of the flow of time that really matters. Now, this is where you could definitely see some of the socialist ideas of, like, Karl Marx and things like that. This idea that there's multiple stages of capitalism and different things. The word capitalism is actually an insult towards the system of production that existed during the early Industrial Revolution, in times in which there was upper classes, and they basically had all of the means of production and all the power. And yet this is suggesting, well, that's just only one stage. The manipulation of that will go away as people get more rights, and there's more equality from that. And so eventually you get more and more state control of industry, eventually, and then you hit communism. Now, I'm not going to discuss whether that's right or wrong. However, that's basically the idea of the flow of history. It's basically implying that, these figures are important, but they're just part of a progress forward view of history. So that's where that comes from. Let's see. So then it talks about how they discuss how these older boys are not happy with the current order of things, because the younger students aren't basically paying them respect. And if anybody knows that in Japanese culture, respect is a huge thing, because in most East Asian cultures, essentially, there is a concept of, like in the West we have pride, but in Japan it's more like they have a thing called face, which this is not an exact idea that can be easily transferred, but basically what it means is it's kind of like your reputation and pride put together. And so losing face to someone, like if you do something wrong, you lose face, and people know about it, they really want to avoid that. And so these upperclassmen being treated disrespectfully, that makes them lose face. And they don't like that. That's like really important to them. And remember, this goes back to the concept of the militaristic Japanese society in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and up the fascism increasing. It's very big on military and being prepared for combat, and worship to the emperor, who you do not say anything bad of. If you caught saying anything bad, they might kill you, literally. And so, it all goes down even to the school level. They're told, hey, the emperor is God, as Westerners would know it. You obey, essentially. And so face is a big component in their society back then, and it is to a lesser extent now. And so talks about that. Let's see. And so eventually there's a snow day, and the kids go outside, and they basically have a snow fight. Well, they eventually make angry the upper class kids, who take it out on them, and they beat up Mizutani first, and then Uragawa comes to help them. Well, Cooper, during this time, while they're having this conflict about being disrespected, as it continued, he's frozen. He can't do anything, and he feels awful about it. And then so he goes home after he like they had a pact that they promised to like back each other up if anything happened. Well, Cooper didn't hang. He didn't like keep to his promise essentially, and so he goes home. He gets sick for weeks, and then well before he told his uncle what happened and how ashamed he was, and his uncle's being like, "Hey, you need to learn how to, if you make a promise, you need to stand up for yourself, and you have to be the best individual you can be. You need to, apologize for that." If you make a mistake, but generally speaking, if you need to hold to your word. That's very important to being an adult and so on like that. And which, of course, as we all know, people who are trustworthy are much more valuable in the context of, like, are we gonna like being around someone who's trustworthy? Yes, we are, of course. So that like a major thing. Cooper gets sick, and eventually he writes a letter apologizing to Katani. And while he was sick, apparently the parents of these students who were beaten up, basically, they go to the school and complain, and this is like a very unusual thing because usually that doesn't happen in their area when multiple families come over and get mad. And so they suspend the older kids for beating them up. And of course, some of the parents are more harder than they said, hey, you should follow the pecking order. That's your fault, But generally speaking, most of them are sympathetic and they go back up their kids. Especially Mizutani's sister, who, reads the letter and here's what happened. It really pushes her wealthy father, who's busy, to, yeah, you need to stand up for your, young son, essentially. And so eventually, for the letters, they end up, like apologizing. Cooper apologizes to them, and they become friends again, even though they hadn't talked for weeks. It was a very serious matter for them. And so eventually, they become friends again. And let's see, it talks about the uncle talks about in his notebook about the nature of humanity. Now, human beings are faulty, and yet it's within our faults. We have to find a way that works for us, and essentially that we must overpass our problems and try to like create a better world for other people and try to like work together essentially. And so let's see. That's about it. Okay. And so at the end of the book, there is essentially, Cooper looks back at the events that happened and he basically comes to the conclusion like, hey, he needs to live his life with principles and discover what he has. And the book ends, how do you live? Which is, of course, the title. And so that is the primary synopsis plot, essentially, of the book. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to give my thoughts on the book. So there's a lot of powerful themes, but I think the three overarching themes, I should say, are important. The nature of humanity and working together, the finding yourself and developing an independent mind on things, and treating everybody with equality, I think are very important in these books. And so I think that this book, like for a younger reader, someone like in the American educational system, like middle school, high school, and so on, would really benefit from this book. Someone who has an open mind, because some people, based off of their circumstances, may not hear other points of view, especially about like poverty and different things. If you come from an upper class background, or if you're from a lower class background and you read this book, you may not understand some of the challenges that wealthy children of wealth face, like loneliness and issues dealing with like nepotism and so on like that. So I think this book really has a lot to offer for anybody who's a younger reader, and I highly recommend it. And I think the movie, when it comes out next year, will be very good, just like most of the other Studio Ghibli movies. All right, thanks everybody for watching, and have a nice day.